There's this very specific, slightly uncomfortable moment that happens to almost all of us. You're sitting on your couch, you're 3 seasons deep into some prestige TV drama or a gritty crime thriller, and the tension is just peaking.
Oh, yeah, like edge of your seat kind of tension.
Exactly. You're gripping the armrests, your heart is racing, and you are actively, desperately hoping that a literal serial killer successfully hides a body so the cops don't catch him.
Right. Or you're, sweating through a bank heist, praying the robbers actually outsmart the SWAT team.
Yes. And then the episode ends, right? The credits roll, the screen goes black,
Right.
and you catch your own reflection in the dark television glass, and you have this sudden, just jarring realization. You ask yourself, wait a minute, what does this actually say about me?
It's a brilliant moment of cognitive whiplash, really. Because in your day-to-day life, you walk around assuming your moral compass is this fixed, non-negotiable instrument.
Right, like, I know murder is abhorrent, I know theft is destructive.
Exactly. But in that moment on the couch, you realize your moral compass isn't pointing to true north at all. It's spinning wildly, just pointing wherever the narrative framing is telling it to point.
And it makes you feel almost complicit, like your own psychology has just been hacked.
Yeah.
And that feeling of, diagnostic muddy waters is exactly what we are plunging into for today's deep dive.
It's such a rich topic to unpack.
It really is. We're going to take apart the machinery of how we decide who is a good guy and who is a bad guy, and we're pulling from some incredibly fascinating research to do it.
Yeah, looking at, media psychology, Carl Jung's theories, historical analyses of 19th century bandits.
And even modern sociological studies on corporate whistleblowers. It's wild. What becomes immediately apparent when you dive into this research is that the concept of a hero or a villain isn't like a moral absolute.
Right, it's not an objective reality. It is a highly volatile, fluid negotiation. We actively construct these labels based on an invisible web of, power structures, psychological needs, and tribal loyalties.
We basically bend our own deeply held values to fit what we need from a person or a character in a specific moment. It is entirely self-serving.
It really is. It's like discovering your moral compass is actually a moral kaleidoscope, shifting colors and shapes depending on how you hold it to the light.
That is a perfect way to describe it. Think about the last time a coworker broke a rule versus the last time you watched a vigilante break a law on screen. Your reaction couldn't be more different.
And by the end of this deep dive, the mechanics behind that difference are going to be laid completely bare for you. The way you consume media, read history, or judge people at work, it's all going to look completely different.
So let's start with that reflection in the TV screen. Why are we so willing to hand out moral free passes to fictional monsters?
Well, to really understand that mechanism, we have to look at the baseline of how human beings consume stories. There's this foundational framework from the 1970s, developed mostly by Dolph Zillman, called affective disposition theory.
Okay, let's break that down. What does affective disposition theory actually mean?
The core premise is that you and I, as human beings, evolved as untiring moral monitors. We are constantly assessing the morality of the people around us.
Which makes total sense from an evolutionary biology standpoint, right? Like if we're living in a tight-knit tribe thousands of years ago, we have to constantly monitor our environment.
Absolutely. You have to know who is sharing the food, who is pulling their weight, and who is like a free rider or an active threat.
Yeah, if you can't morally monitor your environment, you literally don't survive.
Precisely. We are hardwired to render verdicts on the rightness or wrongness of others' actions. And Zillman argued that we just don't turn that monitor off when we engage with fiction.
So it carries over to the couch.
Exactly. Affective disposition theory states that our enjoyment of a narrative is entirely dependent on those moral judgments. We experience an increase in enjoyment when good things happen to characters we like, and when bad things happen to characters we've judged to be immoral.
That is the bedrock of every fairy tale, right? Every ancient myth, every classic Western, the white knight defeats the dragon, the evil stepmother falls off a cliff.
Right. We get this deep, satisfying hit of dopamine when the universe operates according to just moral laws. And the flip side is equally powerful.
What happens on the flip side?
If a character we have judged to be good experiences a negative outcome, our enjoyment plummets. We inherently crave a just world because real life is chaotic and unpredictable.
Oh, completely. You can do everything right, pay your taxes, be kind, and still get hit by a bus.
Yeah. Fiction is supposed to be our refuge from that chaos. We want to see a universe where morality reliably buys a good outcome.
There's actually a perfect example of what happens when a story violates this expectation. A few years ago, there was this British crime drama featuring a detective who was just the absolute pinnacle of ethics. He never bent the rules.
I know exactly the show you're talking about.
Right. And in the final episode of the entire series, he is brutally murdered. And he isn't just murdered randomly. He is murdered as a direct consequence of his unrelenting ethical resolve. His goodness is what gets him killed.
And the audience reaction to that finale was explosive. It wasn't just typical fan disappointment. It was a profound psychological rattling
Yeah.
because it completely violated effective disposition theory.
It rattled our belief in a just world.
Exactly. When a narrative disrupts our hardwired prediction of rewards and punishments, like when goodness is punished with death, it creates massive cognitive dissonance. The brain basically registers a prediction error.
Okay, so that explains why we love a traditional hero and why it hurts when they lose. But here is the massive, unavoidable elephant in the room. If we look at the last 20 years of pop culture, that theory seems to completely fall apart.
You're thinking of the anti-heroes.
Yes. If we are these rigid, untiring moral monitors who demand justice, then we should absolutely despise morally ambiguous characters. We should be repulsed by Dexter Morgan or Walter White or Jack Bauer from 24.
Right, because they lie, they torture, they extort, they murder.
Exactly. Yet they aren't just tolerated, they are beloved cultural icons. So how does our brain allow us to enjoy them if Zillman's theory is completely true?
Well, that is the exact paradox that forced psychologists to update the theory. If our enjoyment relies on evaluating characters, how do we survive the cognitive dissonance of rooting for a murderer?
Yeah, how do we?
The answer lies in a psychological mechanism called selective moral disengagement. It's a concept pioneered by the psychologist Albert Bandura.
Break that down for me. What does selective moral disengagement actually look like in practice?
Think of it as a subconscious spam filter for cognitive dissonance. When someone we like or someone we want to like violates our core moral standards, it creates a spike of psychological discomfort.
Right, the prediction error again.
Yes. And Bandura realized that the human brain is incredibly skilled at alleviating that discomfort through cognitive gymnastics. We basically deactivate our usual moral control mechanisms so we can watch the transgression without feeling guilty.
How does the filter actually work, though? How does it scrub the guilt away?
It operates through a few different avenues.
Hmm.
First, we reconstruct the conduct. We tell ourselves, he's not murdering someone, he's delivering ultimate justice.
Oh, wow, okay. What else?
Second, we obscure who was to blame. Like, he didn't want to hurt that guy. Society forced his hand. And third, we actively ignore or minimize the injurious consequences. We don't think about the victim's family. We just focus on the clever way the protagonist hides the evidence.
It's basically our brain acting as a hyper-aggressive PR firm for the main character. But wait, why do we hire the PR firm in the first place? Why are we working so hard to protect characters who do terrible things?
That brings in another layer, which media psychologist Arthur Rainey calls story schema theory. From the time we're infants, we consume thousands of hours of storytelling. We internalize the grammar of narratives.
So we know the rules before the show even starts.
Exactly. When we sit down to watch a new show, we recognize the genre conventions instantly. We know who the protagonist is because the camera lingers on them, the music swells, their name is in the title.
Ah, and because they are the protagonist, we automatically, almost prejudicially, classify them as the good guy.
That is exactly it. We form an a priori positive disposition. We prejudge them as worthy of our empathy.
So the sequence of events is completely backward. I always assumed we watch a character's actions, evaluate them, and then decide if we like them. But you're saying we decide we like them first, and then figure out the morality later.
Precisely. Because the psychological goal of narrative enjoyment is so vital to us. I mean, we sat down to be entertained. We deploy selective moral disengagement to give them absolute amnesty. We need to keep liking them so we can keep enjoying the show.
That is wild. And there's a fascinating experiment in the research that proves this isn't just a theory, using the show 24.
Yes, the Jack Bauer study.
Right, because Jack Bauer is the ultimate ends justify the means protagonist. He routinely uses extreme visceral torture. How did researchers use his character to prove we are faking our moral outrage?
So researchers Janik and Rainey took a sample of people who identified as massive fans of 24 and a control group of non-fans. They showed both groups a condensed version of the show's first season, highlighting the intense violence and torture.
Now, if humans are objective moral monitors, both groups should judge the torture as immoral and dislike the character.
But as you'd expect, that didn't happen. The fans reported much higher enjoyment and a much greater liking of Jack Bauer. But the data from the regression analyses is where the real insight lives.
What did the data show?
It showed why the fans enjoyed it. They were actively employing those story schemas. Their enjoyment was predicted almost entirely by their identification with the character, completely bypassing any moral judgment of his behavior.
And the non-fans?
The non-fans didn't have that pre-existing emotional bond. They couldn't disengage their moral monitors. They saw a man torturing someone, their brain registered it as deeply immoral, and their enjoyment tanked.
So essentially, we hand the protagonist a moral VIP pass just because their name is on the marquee. It's like a sports fan watching their favorite player commit a blatant foul, but screaming at the ref that it was a clean play.
That's a brilliant analogy. We stretch our ethics as far as they need to go just to maintain the positive emotional disposition required to enjoy the story. We don't judge characters by their actions.
We judge their actions based on whether they are the main character. That perfectly explains the mechanics of how we give these fictional monsters a free pass.
It really does.
But it leaves a massive question unanswered. It doesn't explain why we crave these dark, violent characters in the first place. If we just want to be entertained, why not watch a comedy? What void are they filling?
To answer that, we have to pull back from media studies and look into depth psychology. Specifically, the frameworks built by Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Fictional villains provide a safe playground for us to explore our shadow selves.
The shadow self. That sounds like something out of a horror movie. What exactly is it?
Jung theorized that every human being possesses a shadow, an unconscious, repressed reservoir of our personality that contains socially forbidden impulses. The anger, the greed, the selfishness.
The stuff we're taught to bury from the moment we are born.
Exactly. Freud touched on a similar concept with the id, the primal part of our psyche that operates purely on the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, consequences be damned.
And obviously we have to repress that. In polite society, we can't let the id run the show. If someone cuts me off in traffic, my id might want to run them off the road, but if I actually act on that, I go to prison.
Right. The real-world social and psychological costs of acting out are catastrophic. And the effort it takes to constantly repress those urges burns a tremendous amount of psychological energy. It creates pressure.
So a fictional world acts as a low-cost release valve for that pressure.
Yes. When we watch a morally ambiguous anti-hero operate completely unconstrained by social norms, it provides a deep, cathartic release. We can safely merge our identity with their dark desires for an hour.
We get to vicariously experience the thrill of total rebellion without risking our own lives. But the writers can't just drop a complete psychopath onto the screen and expect us to connect with them. There has to be a bridge, right?
Absolutely. And when you look at the architecture of these characters, that bridge is almost always the tragic backstory. It is the ultimate tool for generating empathy for the devil.
It's the narrative golden ticket. A tragic backstory radically reframes a character's transgressions. It tells the audience, this person isn't naturally evil, they were broken by a cruel world.
It makes their bad behavior understandable. It engages our theory of mind, our ability to attribute mental states to others and understand their motivations.
Right. Think about Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. She is unequivocally ruthless. She orchestrates mass assassinations. She's deeply cruel. But the narrative goes out of its way to show us she's operating in a brutally oppressive patriarchal system.
Yes, and the core motivation driving her atrocities is an incredibly primal, universally understandable drive protecting her children. That maternal drive is the bridge.
Or Frankenstein's monster. He commits horrific murders, but the reader's moral monitor is scrambled because we see his origin. He was abandoned by his creator and systemically beaten by society just for how he looks.
The narrative frames him as a victim of profound existential neglect. And by doing so, it forces us to shift our moral condemnation away from the creature and onto Victor Frankenstein.
You see this in modern media too, like Joel from the video game The Last of Us. He commits acts of staggering violence, basically dooming humanity to save one teenage girl. But millions of players defended him fiercely.
Because the very first 15 minutes of the game forces the player to experience Joel holding his own biological daughter as she is shot and killed. The trauma is established before the transgression.
It makes his darkness feel justified. But there is another layer to this in the research. It's not just about the character's past, it's about our present. The reason we seek out these characters actually fluctuates based on how we are feeling about ourselves on any given day.
This is where we get into morality salience. The study by Say Vogel and Krakowiak at Boston University is just a masterpiece of psychological investigation.
Walk me through it, because this fundamentally changed how I view my own media consumption.
They wanted to test how our own fluctuating self-concept impacts our response to complex characters. They brought in two groups. Group A was asked to write out a detailed list of recent actions they had taken that they were genuinely proud of.
So Group A is sitting there feeling like glowing, upstanding citizens.
Yes. Group B, however, was asked to write down recent behaviors they were ashamed of, times they lied or were selfish. They were primed to feel guilty.
Okay, so they have a moral deficit.
Right. After this priming, both groups read a narrative featuring a morally ambiguous character who does some terrible things and were asked to rate their enjoyment.
And what happened?
The results were stark. Group B, the participants primed to feel bad about themselves, enjoyed reading about the morally ambiguous character significantly more than the people in Group A.
Let's map this onto real life, because the implications are staggering. Let's say I have a rough Tuesday, I snap at a barista, I cut someone off in traffic, I ignore my mom's calls, I go home feeling like a bad person.
We've all been there.
Right. Are you telling me that firing up Netflix to watch a show about a bloodthirsty mob boss is actually a subconscious coping mechanism?
That is precisely what the data suggests. It's a mechanism called downward social comparison. Your brain is dealing with the guilt of snapping at the barista. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But then you watch Tony Soprano physically assault someone. Your brain makes an immediate comparison. You think, well, I might have been rude today, but at least I'm not a violent mobster.
Oh, wow. So watching extreme moral deviance actually restores your own positive self-concept. We are literally using fictional transgressors as cheap therapy to forgive ourselves for our minor sins.
Exactly. But the research also flags a massive danger here, specifically when this bleeds into the real world through fandom infighting. If we are using these characters to regulate our own self-worth, we become dangerously attached to them.
Because our psychological relief is tethered to them. So what happens when someone online points out, hey, this character you love is actually a sociopathic monster?
It feels like a personal attack. If someone condemns the character you've aligned with, they are breaking your spam filter. Admitting the character is wrong means admitting your own psychological mechanism is flawed.
Nobody wants to feel like a bad person. So instead of analyzing the character objectively, fans go to war. They furiously rewrite narrative intentions to justify atrocities.
Right? They weaponize the tragic backstory as concrete proof that the character is morally righteous.
And it's fascinating to watch that play out in fiction. But here is where we have to take a sharp turn. Because giving Walter White a VIP pass is one thing. Nobody actually gets hurt.
True.
But what happens when we take this exact same cognitive machinery, the selective moral disengagement, the tragic backstory, the downward comparison, and apply it to real-life criminals?
This brings us to a crucial intersection of psychology and history. When we apply these frameworks to reality, we create history's most enduring myths. The seminal work here is Eric Hobsbawm's concept of the social bandit.
Let's unpack that. What does social bandit actually mean?
Hobsbawm analyzed common criminals throughout history, specifically in agrarian peasant societies. He noticed a recurring phenomena. These violent outlaws were frequently reframed by the local public as Robin Hood figures.
Stealing from the rich to give to the poor, the ultimate underdog archetype.
Exactly. But Hobsbawm and later critics pointed out an uncomfortable truth. The reality of these outlaws was almost never noble. They frequently extorted and harmed the very peasant communities they lived among.
That is wild. Why would a community cover for a violent criminal who is shaking them down?
This is where the halo effect operates on a macro level. Identified by psychologist Edward Thorndike, the halo effect describes how the human brain craves cognitive ease. Processing complex, contradictory information burns mental energy.
So the brain creates a shortcut. If a destitute community decides an outlaw is their Robin Hood, maybe because he occasionally targets a wealthy landlord, they crown him with that halo.
Right. And once the halo is in place, it acts just like selective moral disengagement for TV characters. Every subsequent violent action is filtered through that positive bias. The cruelty is rationalized as necessary for the cause.
And what is truly fascinating is that the criminals themselves internalize the myth. The research highlights the intense cognitive dissonance within the bandits themselves.
Because even a criminal knows, deep down, that hurting innocent people is wrong. Nobody wants to be the villain of their own story.
So they rationalize their extortion by claiming they're victims of circumstance. They tell themselves they've been forced into a corner by a corrupt state.
Exactly. They view their criminality as a temporary necessity, which magically exempts them from the label of criminal. And there's a terrifying modern example of this in the research regarding the Albanian Canaan.
Walk me through that. How are modern organized crime syndicates weaponizing ancient cultural codes to put a halo on their crimes?
It's a dark case study of narrative manipulation. The Kanun is a set of ancient Albanian cultural codes. Sociologist Jana Arsovska found that modern criminal networks aggressively cherry-pick these romanticized laws to justify contemporary, profit-driven crimes.
Give me a mechanical example of how that works on the street.
Let's look at extortion. The Kanun has strict rules regarding the guest and the host. Disrespecting a guest is a massive violation of honor. Modern criminals will intentionally enter a local bar, act provocatively to trigger an argument, and then claim they were disrespected as a guest.
Wow. They manufacture a violation of an ancient code just to shake down a restaurant?
Yes, they declare their honor violated under the Kanun and use that to justify extortion or even revenge killings. They completely neutralize the moral reality of their crime. They aren't extorting, they are restoring traditional honor.
It is a twisted game of legal twister. They reach back hundreds of years to find an obscure rule just to excuse shaking down a local business. And the public actually buys into it because we inherently love an underdog fighting the system.
The criminal network presents itself not as a mafia, but as a protector of local values against a corrupt state. And this isn't just relegated to the Balkans. The research draws a direct line to modern e-bandits.
Like the hacktivist group Anonymous.
Exactly. The digital myth-making process is identical. Because they operate covertly against faceless institutions, the public romanticizes them. We bypass the actual legality of their actions because they fit the vigilante archetype perfectly.
It's incredibly easy to cheer for the bandit when they are robbing a faceless bank from a massive psychological distance. But what happens when that exact same transgression happens inside your own house or your own workplace?
That brings us to what the research reveals is the ultimate real-world stress test of the hero-villain divide: the whistleblower.
If you want to see how fluid and hypocritical human morality truly is, look at the whistleblower. It's the absolute collision of fairness versus loyalty.
And how we perceive a whistleblower depends almost entirely on which side of the fault line we are standing on.
Let's really break this down, because on the evening news, whistleblowers are universally applauded. They get book deals, they're called brave. But internally, within their actual organizations, they are systematically destroyed. They are fired, sued, socially exiled. Why the massive disconnect?
It comes down to the evolutionary clash between abstract justice and tribal survival. From a macro perspective, society universally values fairness. Exposing corruption benefits the public.
But internally, within the specific group, the overriding moral value is loyalty. The whistleblower is exposing their own group members.
Exactly. That act threatens the group's reputation and survival. To the in-group, the act of objective fairness is perceived viscerally as an act of profound betrayal. There are 3 university studies by Pasili and colleagues that map this paradox perfectly.
Walk me through study 1, because the methodology here is fascinating.
Study 1 focused on high self-relevance. University students were given a scenario where a study group gets a stolen copy of an upcoming exam on WhatsApp. One student says, "This is wrong, I am reporting this," and blows the whistle.
Okay, objectively, a clear act of academic integrity. The students reading this must have rated the whistleblower as a hero, right?
The reaction was the exact opposite. Participants aggressively derogated the whistleblower. They expressed high levels of disgust and anger. And incredibly, they rated the student who stayed silent and covered it up as fairer than the whistleblower.
Wait, stop. They thought the person who covered up a stolen exam was fairer. How does the brain justify that?
Because the cheating benefited the in-group. It helped the students. Therefore, reporting it was seen as an unfair attack on the group's success. Their tribal instincts completely overwrote their abstract sense of justice.
That is wild.
And it went beyond just disliking them. Participants were asked to assign theoretical pain pills to the characters. They overwhelmingly assigned pain pills to the whistleblower to make them suffer.
They wanted to physically inflict pain on the person who reported the cheating. That tribal loyalty is terrifyingly strong. Okay, so what did they do in study 2 to test the boundaries?
In study 2, they lowered the self-relevance. Participants imagined working in a public office where co-workers falsified ID cards. They tested 2 motivations: falsifying records to benefit the local community versus pure financial greed.
So a noble cause crime versus a selfish crime. How did the perception change?
When the fraud benefited the community, the whistleblower was heavily disliked. They were seen as a rigid rule follower disrupting a community benefit.
And when it was just pure greed?
When it was for greed, the whistleblower was liked slightly more. But even then, they still faced subtle retaliatory intentions from the participants.
So even when coworkers are explicitly stealing money for themselves, the person who reports them is still viewed with suspicion for breaking the code of silence. But study 3 is where they expose the absolute hypocrisy of our moral compass, right?
Study 3 is the masterstroke. They used the test cheating scenario again, but manipulated one crucial variable, the identity of the cheaters. Half imagined the cheaters were an out-group corporate employees, half imagined they were an in-group fellow students.
And what were the results when you isolate just the identity?
When the out-group cheated, participants rated the whistleblower as an absolute hero. But when the in-group committed the exact same act, the whistleblower was immediately deemed a traitor and assigned punishment.
It is a proximity sensor. Morality isn't a fixed compass. It's a proximity sensor that only alarms when the threat is close to our own interests.
That's the exact mechanism.
We absolutely love it when a whistleblower exposes a corrupt billionaire on the news because it costs us nothing. But if our coworker reports us for taking a long lunch break, suddenly our selective moral disengagement evaporates. We demand punishment.
We abandon our alignment with fairness the precise second it threatens our own group identity or material self-interest. We use morality as a weapon to police others while demanding immunity for ourselves.
And to make this reality even more uncomfortable, the rules of who gets to be a hero are deeply rigged by societal power dynamics. This brings us to the final layer, the intersectionality of transgression. Who actually has the luxury of being called a hero?
To understand this, we look at the UNODC report by Kubi and Merkel. They found that the hero-villain label is a luxury afforded to some and violently denied to others based on systemic biases, like gender and power structures.
Let's ground this in the Enron case study. Sharon Watkins was vice president there, and she blew the whistle on massive accounting fraud, the textbook definition of doing the right thing.
But look at the friction she encountered. Her internal warnings were initially entirely ignored and downplayed. The researchers point out this is tied to male-dominated corporate biases that dismiss women's authority.
She actually had to report anonymously at first out of sheer terror of retaliation, and based on what we just discussed, she had every reason to be terrified.
Absolutely. The research highlights that female whistleblowers face compounded challenges. Society places higher standards on women for compliant behavior and heavily penalizes assertiveness.
Traits that are coded as strong leadership in men.
Exactly. When a woman blows the whistle, she navigates deeply internalized stereotypes portraying her as disloyal or overly emotional. And even when the media finally framed Watkins as a hero, it was a double-edged sword.
Because they framed her as a moral outsider, right?
Yes. They relied on gendered narratives to paint her as a maternal exception to the boys' club, rather than acknowledging her as a highly competent executive demanding financial accountability. It marginalized her professional identity.
It basically said she's a hero, but only because she doesn't really belong in this cutthroat corporate world.
Exactly. The undeniable takeaway is that a charismatic male anti-hero in fiction, or a historical male bandit, is afforded endless complexity and redemption. We bend over backward to understand their pain.
But a real-world female executive trying to stop massive corporate fraud is stripped of that complexity and treated like a traitor internally because she didn't play along.
It highlights the devastating irony of our moral judgments. We are infinitely lenient with those who commit harm if they fulfill our narrative needs, but we are viciously punitive toward those who do the right thing if it threatens our tribe.
We started wondering why we cheer for the bad guy on TV. We moved through the shadow self, historical myths, and landed on the uncomfortable reality that our view of a whistleblower depends entirely on whether they expose our enemies or expose us.
And the crucial takeaway is to recognize that the boundary between hero and villain is rarely about absolute morality. It reflects our own psychological shadows and our instinct to protect our tribe at all costs.
It really dismantles that feeling of moral superiority we all walk around with, which leaves me with a final, lingering question for you to mull over.
What's that?
If our perception of heroes and villains is truly just a reflection of our own self-interest and group loyalty, what does it mean when society universally agrees on who the good guy is? Are they actually good? Or have they just figured out exactly what we all secretly need to see?
It's a provocative thought. Next time you cheer for the protagonist, it might be worth asking what part of you is really doing the cheering.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the machinery of morality. Keep questioning the narratives around you, and we'll catch you next time.